Gurian-Sherman is a research consultant with Strategic Expansion and Trainings, LLC, focused on supporting ecologically based sustainable agriculture, food sovereignty, and food equity. He was a senior scientist at the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists from 2006 to 2014, where he authored the landmark report, Failure to Yield, evaluating the performance of genetically engineered crops. He was also a scientist at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, responsible for assessing human health and environmental risks from transgenic plants and microorganisms. He was appointed to the inaugural FDA Biotechnology Advisory Subcommittee, has advised the National Research Council and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and is widely cited in national media. He holds a PhD in plant pathology, shared the hallway with Dr. Pamela Ronald in this film as a graduate student, and will be presenting on the narrow and misleading scientific views presented in this film.
So I'd like to pick up on a few of those themes, but also expand on some of the other issues where I think the science is really cherry-picked, as Brian, I think, said, and misleading. It selectively sets up straw men, especially, and it's very good at doing it. It's very slick at kind of portraying people like Alison von Enneman as being sympathetic and showing activists as being kind of foolish and clownish and so forth. But there are many, many scientists that have expertise on the issues that were talked about. They're not necessarily fundamentally anti-GMO, but they have a lot of criticisms about how it's been developed and used. Weed scientists like Dave Mortensen at Penn State or Matt Liebman at Iowa State, who are real experts on that, as opposed to Robert Fraley, who I guess you would have to think has somewhat of a biased perspective on, presenting data, and is presented in the movie as if he is an objective source of information. And the film could have easily gone to the many, many scientists that have substantive critiques of the development and use of this technology and failed to do so, and therefore showed an incredibly one-sided perspective on the science. Belinda, I think, made some really important points about IARC, for example, the International Agency for Cancer Research, which had come out with its findings somewhat prior to the development of this film. That is the most highly respected, probably, science body on the understanding of cancer in materials and processes in the world. The 17 scientists, who are all toxicologists and epidemiologists, independent scientists, respected in their fields, unanimously came to the conclusion that glyphosate was a probable carcinogen, mostly based on animal data, but also based on epidemiology and exposure data in several parts of the world. Mechanisms were determined and so forth. And the director, Scott Hamilton, knew about this and dismissed including the IARC findings, as you said, at least. I mean, even if you accept it as being unsettled, complex science is often unsettled, but if you're actually presenting science, you have a responsibility to present that complexity instead of, a kind of whitewashed version that this movie, and very one-sided movie that this movie presented. What Hamilton said was basically repeating industry talking points. Fraley, in that debate was probably referring to some of this science when he said it's pseudoscience, because he has said that about IARC since their results came out. But that science, Scott Hamilton characterized as well. They, and this is a paraphrase, but it's pretty close. 90% of what they see they call carcinogens. That is simply factually incorrect. Over 50% of what they evaluate, they cannot be determined whether they're carcinogenic. Only 7% are determined to be probable carcinogens, as was the case with glyphosate. And you have to understand that IARC doesn't accept the evaluation of processes or chemicals unless there is already a body of evidence that suggests to them that there's a reasonable chance that these things may be found to be carcinogenic. So they're not taking a random universe of processes and chemicals to begin with. So it's highly disturbing that that wasn't in there. And the reason that's important is that while the movie focuses on, especially on papaya in Hawaii, and a banana trait that is not even shown to work yet. At the stage of development there are many things that go wrong, and there are many formerly promising looking crops, mosaic virus resistant cassava in Africa, high protein cassava in Africa, sweet potato feathery mottle virus resistant sweet potatoes in Africa, that all were said to be very promising and all failed. All technologies have failures, but that was completely glossed over in this movie. So instead, the movie focuses on crops that make up less than 1% of the commercialized acreage of actual GMOs, which are 80 to 85% herbicide tolerant, which is designed to use herbicides on, and another 10 or 15% or 20% or so BT insect resistant. And so, the claims and the distortion of the side, let me give you one example. They flash up on the screen a table that supposedly shows that glyphosate is safer than other herbicides. Well, that's based on what's called acute toxicity.
And table salt.
And table salt. And that's based on acute toxicity, which means how much of it does it take to kill you quickly 50% of the exposed organisms. Well, that's almost completely irrelevant for herbicides. There's very few herbicides that are highly acutely toxic. What is more relevant is chronic toxicity, like cancer, which was, again, ignored. So to say, and I'm speaking as a former EPA scientist, and my job was, significantly to do this kind of analysis. So it completely misrepresented what toxicity actually is. And, but it has the gloss of science on it. And so the whole premise of the way this was done was to try to convince you that what is representative are these crops that have either never been commercialized, make up a tiny percentage, and ignore what is it that is determining that 99% of these crops, or let's say 80 to 85, are designed to be, have herbicides, to pesticides applied to them. And the other 15% have not reduced overall the use of insecticide, the BT crops. In the US, and this is important, the USDA ignored insecticide use of a certain kind that has become almost ubiquitous on major crops like corn, soybeans, and wheat. Some of you may have heard about this. They're called neonicotinoids. They're an incredibly toxic insecticide to insects, pollinators, bees. You may have heard of what have been popularly called bee-killing insecticides in the media. And what's happened is, and this is where the film is really insidious. They try to suggest that glyphosate is less harmful, is less toxic, than the herbicides that it has replaced. But then when they talk about insecticides, they completely ignore the fact of their own claim, which does have some validity, that it's not just the amount used, it's the inherent toxicity and what is the chemical inherently toxic too. Well, these neonics are used to coat seeds at much lower volume than the insecticides they replaced. But we're treating grossly more acreage with those insecticides than before, and that was completely ignored in the film. So, for example, corn, our most widely planted crop in the US, previously about 20 to 30, roughly 30% of acres were treated with insecticide. Now, almost 100% of corn acres are treated with these neonics, which are causing massive environmental, and there are hundreds of scientists who have written on that. So, the engineered crops did not cause, although they are associated, and we could get into that, with the use of these neonics. But unlike the claim in this movie and many of the scientists who support genetic engineering, these crops have not meaningfully reduced the use of insecticide. In many cases, that use has gone up. And then we could get into insecticide resistance as well. Going back a little bit to the herbicide-resistant crops, Alison von Ennenem, made this kind of off-the-cuff kind of dismissal of resistant weeds, saying, oh, well, if we weren't using glyphosate, we'd go back to more harmful herbicides. Well, actually, that's exactly what's happened, and what good weed scientists have pointed out, which is that because of the massive weed resistance that's not yes, resistance to all pesticides and antibiotics is a fact of life. But these crops have encouraged dramatically higher resistance in weeds that Fraley dismisses as only 12 weeds than would have occurred without them because of the way they're used. The crops were designed for the use of these herbicides. And yes, farmers like them because they save them time, but that doesn't mean it's good for the farming community, good for workers, good for good for us overall as a society. So what's happened is because of this huge increase of these weeds, some of which are incredibly hard to control, the National Academy of Sciences had what is called weed summits, national weed summits to deal with this crisis in weed control, as weed scientists very well know, and none of them were on this panel. And so what's happened is, and Monsanto loves this, they have a second generation of herbicide-resistant crops that is not replacing glyphosate, but is adding to it. And in fact, those herbicides were developed in the 40s and 60s and are highly dangerous and are drifting over other crops and damaging soybeans, local foods, peaches, tomatoes, and so forth, which is the nature of these highly destructive herbicides like 2,4-D, which was in Agent Orange, and dicamba, which was released last year and caused probably over 3 to 4 million acres of damage to soybeans and other crops because of Monsanto's release of this. Well, that's so exactly what Alison von Ennenem kind of sloughed off as being, not a reality is exactly what's happening. So why, I think we need to really go back, if we're going to be honest, and ask why is 99% of the acreage in these crops? It's increased monoculture. None of the major promises of genetic engineering have come true. Dead zones around the world in the Gulf of Mexico. Last year, the dead zone caused by monoculture industrial farming that this is part of was the biggest in history. And we could go down biodiversity loss, pesticide use, air pollution, water pollution. They've all either gotten worse due to these crops or not been improved. The final thing I want to say is about organic and some of the stuff that was associated with that, which I think was really insidious. I don't have time to go into all of that, but clearly agroecological farming systems can, whether they're organic or near organic, have been shown clearly by research at many universities to be as or more productive, eliminate or cut the use of pesticides by 90 to 95% or more if they're not organic. And have tremendous environmental and local economic benefits, not mentioned at all in this film. Instead, there was this false, not even a false dichotomy, that paper in the New York Times by Eric Lipton that the film kind of shows Chuck Benbrook as being on the take and so forth. Chuck has been pretty transparent about where his funding has come from. What wasn't talked about was that article in the New York Times by Eric Lipton focused mainly on Monsanto and the big companies' influence under the table and non-transparently on so-called academic independent scientists. Monsanto has spent way more than the organic industry on both research, funding in land-grant universities that silences scientists from being willing to speak out because they fear for their funding and their careers. This is all very well documented. And the fact that they focused on Benbrook, who, in the organic industry, that's fair. But they get a tiny fraction of what the Monsantos and Syngentas and Bayers are paying to do that. So, from one end to the other, this film was bad science, disingenuous, showed an incomplete picture. And as Marion Nessel, who was in it, and Michael Pollan, who strenuously objected to the way their interviews were used and called this film propaganda, I absolutely agree. What this kind of film does, in the end, will only cause cynicism and only harm science because it is clearly, slick, it's well done, but it is really a disservice to science and really a disservice to the public in terms of our understanding of these issues, which are really quite complex. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.